Chief Operating Officer for SWAT Solutions, a technology consulting firm focused on quality assurance based here in Minnesota. Prior to his position at SWAT Solutions, Todd was Vice President at Thomson Reuters, running various organizations over his 11-year tenure there. Todd is very active in the business community and supports many technology and education-based organizations. He serves on the board of directors of the Minnesota High-Tech Association, is also a member of the Minnesota Science and Technology Authority Advisory Commission, was a member of the Humphrey Institute P16 Commission on Education, was a delegate to the National Governors Association Summit on STEM Foundation, and also serves on the board of the Minnesota Academy of Science. Please join me in welcoming Todd Hausholt.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you. And thanks to both candidates for coming. If you have a television, you know who's next to me. And we won't go into deep bios, but I think we'll just start right off with some of the questions. Today will be a little bit different than a lot of the debates because we're going to be focusing on technology initiatives that are important to not only this room, but also the economy for Minnesota. First question, and we will start with Mr. Horner. The private sector has used technology to innovate during these challenging times over the last few years. We use this to change our business process and to apply and control our costs. How do you see government under an administration using innovation and technology to be more efficient, more streamlined for the future?
You know, I think that's really one of the compelling differences among the three candidates, that where we have Senator Dayton, Representative Emmer, too often looking in the rearview mirror to figure out how we correct the problems that we have with solutions from yesterday. We really need to be looking to the future. And I think, frankly, in a lot of ways, Minnesota state government under Gopal's direction has moved us in a lot of the right direction. Now we need to be much bolder as we look to the next 4 years and think entirely differently about solutions. So let me give you a couple of examples. There's a terrific company that some of you may be familiar with, American Telecare, that is working with Mayo on its insured population to figure out how we can better coordinate care for those with chronic conditions. What makes this program really exciting is that they're dealing with an elderly population. They've created interactive touchscreen computers that allow these elderly patients to do their daily diagnostics, to have daily interaction with care providers, and in doing so, they've been able to identify the red flags, the warning signs that allow them to change the care before these people need hospitalization, before expenses mount up. They've managed the chronic conditions in a way that is producing much better quality of life for these people while substantially reducing the costs. We ought to be doing that in our public health programs. We ought to be doing that to deliver better quality care at lower cost. Now the challenge is that it takes some money, it takes an investment up front to get to that. We have to be willing to do that. We have to have the courage, the innovation, the boldness to make those kinds of decisions. And the second example that I'd offer is something that I've championed that I think really brings greater accountability to our government. And that is, we ought to start government processes by saying, what's the outcome that we need to achieve? Not how much are we going to spend and how do we make it bigger, or how much do we spend and how do we make it smaller? But what is it that we're trying to achieve? What's the outcome that's important to Minnesota's prosperity, and then design our programs from there. But we ought to go a step further than just identifying the outcomes. We ought to create the technology that allows every Minnesotan to see the outcome, to see the measurements, to be able to go on a website to understand what is the program, how much are we spending, what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, and what's the progress we're making toward those goals. That's how we're going to bring greater accountability to government. That's how we're going to get better value for our tax dollars. That's how we're going to help the state move forward.
Thank you. Senator Dayton, same question.
I want to thank all of you for the invitation today. I believe this is the 28th debate that Mr. Horner and I have attended together, and there's 3 more to go. And I want to thank you for your important contributions to our economy and then really to the well-being of our society. You know, I worked for Governor Rudy Perpich as his Commissioner of Economic Development, and he was original, but he used to refer to Minnesota as the brain power state. And the brain power that you and your innovations, your companies have brought to Minnesota, say, not only enhanced our economy, but really enhanced our quality of life. The conversations I've had with management consultants in the private sector who've worked with Republican and Democratic governors across this country about opportunities to improve the administrative efficiencies, taking advantage of innovations in technology and just general administrative efficiencies, accounts payable consolidation, human resources alike, have impressed on me, in their view, that the state of Minnesota really has not been as receptive as many other states to these opportunities over the last 8 years in particular. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity to bring in the expertise of you in the private sector and others who can help government find ways to provide the essential public services more cost effectively. I mean, that's going to be an imperative for whoever's the next governor, the next legislature. It's going to be imperative for mayors and county commissioners and school board administrators. I mean, it's just essential that we continue to find ways that we can streamline government processes and make it more cost efficient. That's really a commitment I have. And I think that the private sector's expertise is particularly valuable because it's not something that government comes naturally to government. And I remember coming in as state auditor back in 1991, and they just completed the process the previous couple of years under the direction of the legislature to standardize these school districts' chart of accounts. And by the time and put it into a statewide computer accounting system. And by the time they agreed on all the details that they thought needed to be included, there were 17 different decimals to the chart of accounts, which then almost obviated the intent because people were making subjective decisions about which particular coding, according to 17 digits, was appropriate for this expenditure or another. And when they came back a couple of years later, they found they'd made it so impossibly complicated. But as I say, that rather than objectifying and standardizing school accounting, they'd almost achieve the opposite result. So I think we have great opportunity to bring your expertise to government and take advantage of that, and I certainly look forward to that opportunity if I'm elected governor.
Thank you, Senator. The next question, we'll start with you, Senator Dayton. During the last legislative session, the Minnesota legislature passed the angel investment tax credit as well as an R&D tax credit. These are both critical to the growth of small businesses, primarily in the technology sector. Do you agree that the state government should play a role in to incent new businesses and new venture investments, and would you support additional or expansion use of this in the future?
My budget, yes, I do support it. My budget provides for its continuation in both the next 2 fiscal years. I know Representative Emmer voted against that tax credit legislation. I think that it was very important as the state was, particularly with regard to Wisconsin, losing some of those decisions. And, you know, again, as serving previously as Commissioner of Economic Development for Minnesota, I'm a strong believer that we are always in competition with other states and that we need to provide targeted incentives such as the angel investor tax credit, such as back then we had the enterprise zone tax credit and other incentives that were proven effective in business location or expansion decisions that would not have been made in Minnesota's favor otherwise. So yes, I do support the continuation of that and look forward to working with you to find out how we can make it better targeted and more effective and more productive for Minnesota. And I think as returns as these other programs in the past properly structured have demonstrated, we'll find that the economic returns to the state are greater than the initial investment.
Thank you. Mr. Horner.
Well, one of the great things about doing so many debates is that we establish a pretty clear record of where we stand on the issues. And so, Senator, it's interesting now that you talk about opening up government to outsourcing, when in fact a lot of the savings in your budget, a lot of your rhetoric has been exactly the opposite, where you've opposed outsourcing, where you've said you're going to get savings by stopping outsourcing of exactly the kinds of services that would drive innovation. So there needs to be a consistency, because that's really what we need from government. So a couple of things. My budget, unlike Senator Dayton's budget, includes tax reform. where we do need to put more money into investment incentives. I think the angel investment credit was a good first step, but we need to be bold and look at other incentives. We ought to take a look at whether or not it makes sense to allow individual investors in startup companies to write off losses against personal income. You know, look what happens when you make an investment in a startup company. Most of that investment goes to pay somebody's salary. The state gets a benefit from that. Now, we hope the company succeeds, but even if the company fails, the state still has derived benefit. It's created a job for however long. To create that kind of incentive opens up a whole new pool of capital. We need to be smart about these kinds of things. We need to make these investments. And what we certainly can't do, I would guess many of the companies represented in here are S-Corps and LLC. I think, Senator, you need to ask them what happens to their job creation, what happens to their innovation if they have to take a 30 to 40% increase in their state income taxes. I'm going to guess that a lot of that innovation leaves Minnesota. A lot of the jobs are never created. We've got to be consistent. We have to speak to the future. We have to have policies that match the rhetoric. We have to have rhetoric that inspires people. We have to have rhetoric that opens the door to new innovation, to good thinking, to creativity, to really creating jobs, to being bold, to trusting the brilliance of the people in this room, the people in this industry.
Thank you. Candidate Horner. For over a year, the Minnesota Ultra High Speed Broadband Task Force has pulled together, fairly aggressive recommendations of, having ubiquitous broadband access throughout the state by 2015. Do you support the goals of this organization, and are you committed to making these goals a reality if elected?
Absolutely, and I congratulate Rick King, who chaired the commission, all of the people who worked on it. I think it does set the bar high, and we ought to be committed to achieving that. But we can't just rely on recommendations. I think we need to take the next step. We need to figure out how do we expand access to broadband statewide. And I hope that in most areas it is a private investment. In some areas it's going to be a private-public partnership. And in some areas it's probably going to take a public investment. And we ought to be willing to make that investment, because access to high-speed broadband is going to be the gateway to world-class education, world-class health care, world-class economic development opportunities. And we ought to be willing to do that. We ought to be willing to say that that is our future. That is where we need to go. So those are important goals for us. We do need to make a commitment to it. We do need to say that this is important for the state, and we're going to make that investment.
Okay. Senator Dayton.
Absolutely, yes, and it's in the economic development proposal I put out several months ago, and my terrific running mate, State Senator Yvonne Pretner-Solon, carried the legislation to establish the task force, and I support its recommendations. We'll work with it to implement them. I have said that I know from traveling all over the state now over the last several months that we need to have border-to-border seamless high-speed internet connection, and we need to have border-to-border seamless cell phone connection. And that's crucial to allowing people to live and conduct business anywhere and everywhere in this state, which is crucial to competitiveness in this global economy. So go up, for example, to Lutsen, Minnesota, and talk with the tourism businesses up there, and they'll say it's crucial, and including going up farther north to the Gunflint Trail. That even though people are going up there for a weekend of relaxation and respite from the cities, they still want to have that internet connection. And those that can provide it have a definite advantage over those who can't. Similarly, just last week, being up in East Grand Forks and Moorhead, right adjacent to, part of a border metropolis with Grand Forks and with Fargo, sizable populations, absolutely no cell phone coverage through AT&T whatsoever. Well, again, to allow people to be everywhere in the state and to be successful everywhere in the state. Both of those are essential, and I'll support the task force and look forward to working with those and as other ideas, other technologies, working for additional federal funds. The stimulus funds have been instrumental in funding some of these initiatives, and we need to continue that, and it definitely needs to be a public-private partnership.
Thank you. This is for the Senator as well to start. Tech-based businesses, as you know, are important to the economy. And to make sure they continue to compete, not only nationally but globally, we need a world-class education system to support that. Particularly for this crowd in the area of STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math. Do you support targeted investments in STEM education, both in the K-12 system as well as higher ed? And also, do you have any specific suggestions for that area?
Well, first of all, we need to balance the budget. So whatever proposals I would make for further initiatives have to be in the context of first balancing the budget. But the state funding for public K-12 education has been reduced by $1,300 per student in real after inflation dollars over the last 8 years. Our commitment overall to higher education has gone from 12th highest among among the states in the nation at the beginning of this decade to 32nd highest today. We have among the highest tuitions in our 2-year public colleges, our 4-year public universities, the University of Minnesota. And so we are not making the investments, and so we're not making the investments overall, and that applies to areas like science and technology as well. I was a 9th grade science teacher in New York City right out of college. I know that you need to make the additional investments in laboratories and other equipment and technology necessary. We put an emphasis on testing. In the last decade in the state and nation, the 3rd through 11th grade students are subjected to 61 different tests, I'm told. Well, I asked myself when I was in the Senate, why is there such an emphasis on this testing? And, accountability is absolutely important, absolutely. On the other hand, I concluded that in part, it's easier to be talking about testing and the lower cost of that rather than the cost of putting a computer on every desk, in every classroom, in every school in America. And if we make those kinds of investments in the providing our students for all backgrounds and all walks of life with the tools and the technology that they're going to need to be successful in the years ahead, then we'll start to reap the benefits of those investments in the future in this global economy.
Mr. Horner.
Well, so first of all, let me just clarify a point because I don't want to fall into the same bucket. Back to the broadband. I do think that there will be areas of the state where we need to have public investment to create access to broadband. I don't know that the same situation is true in cell phone. I don't think the government ought to be involved in every aspect of our lives, certainly. And so, Senator, I just suggest that maybe you ought to look into Verizon because I got pretty good reception up in
I have one with Verizon, too. I have one of each.
So, but let me talk about the importance of STEM. I agree, and I will congratulate Senator Dayton because I think he has spoken articulately to the need for investment in higher education, and I do think that also is an important part of our budget. We need to make that commitment. We need to make higher education accessible. We need to make it affordable. We need to make sure that our 2-year schools in particular are well funded and are the bridge. But let me talk to where I think we do differ, and that is, I'll give you an example. The largest school district in the state, Anoka-Hennepin, superintendent there, last year was going to lose a terrific vocal music program. Went to Education Minnesota and said, give me some flexibility on seniority. This is a great program, a great young teacher. We're going to lose the program. Give me some flexibility. Allow me to exempt 1% of positions from the strict seniority requirements. Now, this is a school district with 2,800 teachers. He's asking for 28 waivers. Education Minnesota said no. He said, next year, in another high school, I'm going to lose an engineering program. Again, a great young teacher, engaging students, getting them involved in a critical component of STEM. We're going to lose the teacher, and with it, we're going to lose the program. Give me 1/2 of 1%. 14 waivers out of 2,800 teaching positions. And Education Minnesota turned them down. We can't afford that. It is great to say that we ought to have more STEM in our higher education, but if we're not making the investments in K-12, we're not going to get them there in higher education. And to get there, we do need to think differently about K-12, about how it's structured. I mean, look at what happens right now. You could walk into just about any high school in Minnesota, and it wouldn't be much different from the high school classroom I walked into my freshman year. Maybe you'd have a whiteboard instead of a blackboard, you'd have tables and chairs instead of desks, you'd have a few computers in the room, but what happens in that classroom? The basic interaction between the teacher and the students, largely the same. I started high school in 1964. What institution has remained that static that long? And yet, look at how we address the challenges. More money, blame the teacher, do this, do that, instead of figuring out how the kids learn. How do we get them engaged in STEM? How do we get them to think differently? You know, in 1964, my big purchase of the year, Meet the Beatles. And I was really excited about that. Capitol Records told me exactly what music I would listen to and the order in which I would listen to that music. What 8-year-old would put up with that today? What 8-year-old would say, well, that's okay? Not many. They want to interact with information. They want to create their own information. And they do it. And they do it in every phase of their lives until they get to the classroom. And so look what happens. We get to February, and come February, some of the kids already have learned the lessons, and we say, well, you're going to have to be bored for a couple of months. And some of the kids are still trying to figure out October's lessons. And the teacher, because we've put such rigid restrictions on our great teachers, have to teach to January. And our answer, policymakers say, well, we've got to have smaller classrooms. We have to have smaller class sizes. I don't know, maybe. But what if instead we said, you know, the answer really is, let's engage students in the way they really learn. And let's allow them to design interactive learning lessons using the expertise of trained teachers, using the expertise of paraprofessionals. Maybe the answer isn't 20 kids, maybe it's 50 kids. But it's 5 pods of 10 kids working under the guidance of a professional, interacting with information on their own terms, learning at their own pace, not bound by a calendar, not bound by the clock, learning the way kids interact with information. Not the way I interacted with information in 1964, but the way kids do today. That's where we need to think differently. That's where we need to think boldly. And looking in the rearview mirror, because we're dictated to by the unions, because we're dictated to by special interests, is not going to move us forward on this important issue of STEM. We need to be bolder. We need to be more innovative. We need to say to our great teachers, you help us design new classrooms, and we, the policymakers, will be with you. And we hope Education Minnesota is sitting at the table with us as partners and giving us some flexibility on seniority and giving us some flexibility on certification so that in our secondary schools, we have the expertise in the classrooms teaching the students in the areas where we need development, we need innovation.
Thank you. Mr. Horner, as a follow-up, you brought up some changes in education system and teaching. The private sector for a long time has been proposing to have professionals from the private sector to become adjunct or to become teachers in certification. So far to date, Education Minnesota, our teachers union, has not been supportive of this. Are you in support of licensing teachers from the private sector, even though they may not have gone through professional training, traditional training to be an educator? And then how do you plan on working with the teachers union if you do support this?
Yes, I think that's critical. Now, I do believe that anybody in a classroom needs training in the art of instruction. But I don't think that they need all of the lessons that are being demanded by Education Minnesota. I think we do need some more flexibility. We do need to have expertise. And so my proposal would be, let's figure out what the right training is, allow certification in areas of technical education in particular at the secondary level. And I think for all of the reasons that you know all so well, that makes a great deal of sense, and we ought to move forward with that. And the way I work with Education Minnesota would be to invite them to the table to figure out what is the right program for training to make sure that we have some flexibility, that we can move forward. But I'll also say this, that I think it is so important, and where I think that I have more so than Senator Dayton, more so than Representative Emmer, the inclination, the ability, the temperament to build consensus among the public. And on issues like this, if we keep relying on the legislature, if we keep relying on Education Minnesota, there's no reason to believe that anything's going to change. What would change in the next 4 years from the last 4 years? And can we afford that? I don't think we can. And so the next governor, to be successful in this area, in so many other areas, is going to have to be a governor that goes over the heads of the legislature, engages those 60, 70% of Minnesotans, of parents, of professionals, of students who really believe in this, who understand the need for this. Build the consensus there and bring that political will back to the legislature. That's how we'll get it done.
Thank you. Senator Dayton.
Well, I can digress for a moment, since Mr. Horner brought up the Beatles, to recount a searing experience back in 1964 when I was a few years ahead of him in high school, and my high school hockey team was having its annual banquet end of season in February of that year at our coach's home, also one of my teachers in high school. So I had to be well behaved, and the Beatles were appearing for the first time in the United States on the Ed Sullivan Show, and I was all excited. So just as Ed Sullivan said, now, and here's the Beatles, 4 of my teammates swooped down, prearranged signal, picked me up and locked me in the closet in my coach's living room, and so I missed the Beatles. Unfortunately, because of the absence of technology back then, we didn't have instant replays, so I wasn't able to watch. Back to the question. I taught 9th grade general science in New York City out of college. I was pre-med in college. I took advanced physics, and I took biology and chemistry and organic chemistry. I knew 9th grade general science upside down and inside out. But that didn't make me a good teacher. And the skills of becoming an effective teacher were ones that I had to learn separately from my academic knowledge. So if there are people who are in the private sector who have the expertise that the question describes, who are willing to make that commitment, a career change and commitment to teaching in our public schools, elementary, secondary, post-secondary, that's fantastic. And there is right now in Minnesota an alternative licensure method by which they can apply, and school districts can apply for a waiver. Now, the Minnesota Department of Education, I'm told, has been resistant. Not the Education Minnesota, the Department of Education. I remember being in an elementary school on the east side of St. Paul a few years ago, and it was 90% of the students are Hmong. None of the teachers spoke Hmong. 2 of the teaching assistants spoke Hmong. And the principal and the superintendent of St. Paul, recognizing that was a very important skill to have for some of the teachers to have, to speak the language that 90% of the students spoke, applied to the Minnesota Department of Education for a waiver, and they were denied. Well, my Department of Education, if I'm governor, would approve those kinds of requests. And so I'd like to see what the problems are within the existing law. If there are barriers that prevent people who are willing to make that commitment, are willing to learn the skills of becoming effective teachers and impart the expertise, the specialized knowledge they have to our students, I'm all in favor of that, and I'll work to make sure that can happen.
Thank you, Senator. One more formal question, and then we will open it up with Senator Dayton, you being able to close first, and then to Mr. Horton to give a general overview on your views. So, for technology specific for this audience. The question to Senator Dayton, do you believe there are changes that could be made to the Minnesota business tax structure that balances the state's need to provide services as well as individuals' businesses' needs to invest in their growth?
Well, again, the first challenge we have is to eliminate a $5.8 billion projected deficit for the next biennium. So I'm not in a position to propose tax reductions, with exception of something like the angel investor tax credit, which is included in my budget as a continuation. I believe in principle, Senator Tom Bach and others have proposed it previously, that there be a 10% exclusion for income through Subchapter S corporations or for LLCs, so if that money can be reinvested in the business and not be taxed at the individual level. That's that approach I would like to look at. at in the future. I think the Minnesota corporate tax system is regressive, and that smaller businesses that do most or all of their business within Minnesota pay a higher corporate tax rate than the larger corporations with the three-part apportionment formula pay a lower effective tax rate, and that's one that's being adjusted over the next couple of years to conform to Wisconsin. And again, that's something I'd like to consider doing in the future, but I'm very clear I'm not in a position to propose doing that at this point in time.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Horton.
Well, it's nice to see that Senator Dayton is getting religion this late into the campaign. You know, we do need a tax overhaul. We have a tax system largely created in the 1960s and 70s for a very different kind of economy and a very different demographic. When we had a lot of young families coming into their high-earning, high-spending years, a tax system heavily dependent on income taxes worked very well. It's one of the reasons why Minnesota was able to invest in education and health care and our physical infrastructure and do well in the 60s, 70s, 80s, set up the success we've had in the 90s and in the last decade. Today, we have a very different economy. We have an economy invested in service and knowledge. We have a population that is growing older. As a direct result of the tax system we have and of bad public policies, we have too much dependence on property tax, and we have too much dependence on income tax. And the consequence is that we have a great deal of unfairness here and a high level of volatility on the income tax side. You look over the last dozen years or so, and one of the reasons why we have some years with big surpluses and some years with big deficits is the volatility of the income tax. To put more reliance on the income tax, to say that we're going to tax 4% of the population at a rate 30 to 40% higher than we are today, and that's going to fix a problem, it exacerbates the problem. It makes it worse. It makes a great bumper sticker, but it's terrible economic policy. And so Senator Dayton talked about Senator Bach, who is this year's chair of the Senate Tax Committee, a Democrat from northeastern Minnesota. He proposed a tax reform very similar to what I've been talking about. The Business-Led Tax Reform Commission, appointed by Governor Pawlenty, recommended reform very much what I'm talking about. Art Rolnick, who retired after 25 years in the Federal Reserve System, one of the most respected economists, looked at the three budget proposals from Horner, from Emmer, from Dayton, and said mine was the best. Newspapers around the state have looked at the three budget proposals and consistently have said mine is the best, because it drives reform. It changes a tax system that is out of date to one that reflects the economy. First of all, we create investments for individuals and businesses to invest more, to invest in new businesses, in research, development, technology, new equipment. Not tomorrow, not a year from now, not 5 years from now, starting in 2011. And secondly, we're honest enough to say that we're going to pay for it through a consumption tax, lower the sales tax rate by a full %. You're buying big ticket items, you'll get a break. Medical care, food, essential services will continue to keep tax exempt. Clothing, which actually increases the progressivity of the sales tax, we ought to tax the way most states have. Same with personal services. That's where our economy is today. It does two things. One is that it gives the government a predictable flow of income so we can make good long-term decisions about education, healthcare, research, infrastructure, the things government ought to be doing. But secondly, we have in Minnesota more and more people, like the country, not paying any income tax at all. If you don't pay any tax, it's pretty easy to be an advocate of more government spending. As a principle, as good economic policy, we need to connect people to the cost of government based on their ability to pay so that everybody has a stake in controlling the cost of government, in making government more accountable. We need tax reform, not just more taxes.
Thank you, Mr. Horner. This will be the last question. We'll start with Senator Dayton and then close with Mr. Horner. You have a room full of 250 IT professionals here, well-respected and leaders in the industry. You've got about 2 minutes left each. What would you like to say to this group of individuals? Senator Dayton.
Well, this election is about Minnesota's future. It's about your future. It's about a recognition, and some of you I would affect by my tax proposal. If you're making over joint filers actual income of over $173,000 a year, and an individual over $152,000, I would ask you to pay higher taxes on that that amount of your income above those levels. Not to raise taxes for the sake of raising taxes, because I know everybody doesn't like to pay taxes, but because we have a $6 billion, $5.8 billion projected deficit. And because essential services like quality education, I think we all agree, is essential to educating the future entrepreneurs, employers, as well as employees of this state, and other essential public services are vitally at stake here. And because the context of this is that the Minnesota Department of Revenue says that the top 10% of income earners in Minnesota pay a smaller percentage of their income in state and local taxes, about 80% compared to everyone else. The top 1%, people making over $1.2 million a year, pay 2/3, according to the Minnesota Department of Revenue, the percent of their incomes in state and local taxes. Back under Governor Arne Carlson, a Republican governor in the middle 90s, when we enjoyed much higher economic growth in this state relative to other states, and in real terms than we have over this last decade, the state and local tax burden of this state was relatively evenly distributed. Now it's become steeply regressive. Mr. Horner, I disagree with you. Clothing tax is regressive. More income, middle income people pay a higher percentage of their income in tax on a sales tax on clothing than would upper income people. Similarly, the Minnesota Department of Revenue says that the sales tax on services falls 2.5 times more heavily on people in middle income as a percent of their income than people in the top. So what I'm trying to do with my proposal is redress some of the inequity existing in the Minnesota tax system, because if we're going to ask people to pay taxes in this state, then we need to make it fair. And people will pay taxes more willingly if they understand that everybody else is paying their fair share. And I don't fault anybody individually for that. These are policies that were made by governors, by a president, that have had those compounded effects over the last 16 years. But the reality is that those taxes have become more aggressive at the top. I'm trying to redress that balance, generate revenues, along with spending cuts necessary to position Minnesota for the economic growth that we all know it needs to be successful in the future.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Dayton. Mr. Horner.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity, and let me start where Senator Dayton ended. How many of your businesses would create strategic plans for the future based on what you were doing 15 years ago? Why would we design economic policy for the state based on what worked in the mid-1990s? Ludicrous. That's not what's going to get us moving to the future, but that's exactly where we're at in this campaign, and it does frame, I think, the challenge of this campaign. We have one candidate who says, we'll just cut everything, we'll reduce the status quo, we'll make it as small as possible, and everything will be fine. We have another candidate who says, oh no, we'll tax 4% of the population, we'll make the status quo a lot bigger, and Minnesota will be fine. And my approach, the status quo isn't working for a lot of people. The status quo doesn't work for a lot of Minnesotans, for individuals, for businesses, for the state, for our future. We need to redesign the status quo. We need to think differently, more boldly about the future. We need to be open to innovation. We need a tax system that works for the future, not for the mid-1990s. We need a tax system that spurs innovation, that spurs development, that encourages entrepreneurs to grow in Minnesota, to create jobs in Minnesota, to create the new ideas in Minnesota. That's our future, and that's what this campaign is all about. In Senator Dayton, you have a person who is proposing a tax proposal that even most Democrats won't support. In Representative Emmer, a Republican who is proposing tax cuts that even most Republicans won't support. Would a Governor Dayton take the state a few steps to the left? Of course. And then Republicans will yank him back. Emmer, a few steps to the right? Of course, until Democrats yank him back. Does anyone in this room think that we can be a state that is moving sideways, left or right? We need to be moving to the future. We need bold leadership. We need somebody who's going to look to the future. So let me leave you with this. Over the last couple of days, Senator Dayton's staff or the DFL or somebody has been calling Minnesotans to say, who are you going to vote for? And when they say Horner, they say, well, you know, Horner's a vote for Emmer. No, it's not. Horner's a vote for Horner. Horner's a vote for the future. I greatly respect Senator Dayton. I disagree with his policies, and I greatly have come to respect Representative Emmer, but I disagree with his policies. Here's what I would ask of you. You need to vote the future. You need to vote for what is in the best interest of Minnesota. You need to vote to break the gridlock. We can't afford 4 years of stagnation. And so if you want bold leadership in the governor's office in January of 2011, it only starts with bold leadership from you, the voters, next Tuesday. Thank you very much.
All right, Mr. Horton, Senator Dayton, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to commit to this, and a very busy week for you. 6 days to go. But I want to thank you because of your busy schedules and the time that you've given, been honest and open, and would like to invite you both to the MHTA Techni Awards on November 3rd. I believe you're free that night, correct? Where
just as long as you promise no debate.
Okay, no debate, just 1,000 people recognizing Minnesota innovation at the Minneapolis Convention Center. But please join me in thanking both candidates for their great efforts.
Thank you very much.